So welcome to this launch event. I'm Simon Ashford, I'm chair of UACES, and I'm really happy we're doing this. We talk a lot about EDI, but we don't necessarily get much further than talking about it. And I think one of the things that's really great about working with UACES is that we have actually tried to move beyond that. And today's report launch is really kind of a representation of that. I'm here just to kind of manage the traffic, but my main job is to introduce our sartorially matched authors, Roberta Guerrina and Koen Slootmaeckers, who are respectively the former EDI officer and the current EDI officer of UACES, and they are going to talk to us about EDI in European Studies Canon. They're going to talk us through the report, and we can put a link to that in the chat for those who haven't already had a look at it, for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But if people have got questions that already occur as we go along, you can stick that in the chat, but we will come back to you in any case in about 30 minutes. So Koen, Roberta, I don't know who's going to go first, but take it away.
You will. I will do the technicality. We're just going to share our screen. Just give us a moment of technical stuff. And there we go. That should give you a screen.
Brilliant. So I'm going to kick off the conversation today about the sound of silence. What this report is about is the combination of the work that was actually started by Catherine Wright, who was the first EDI officer for UACES. And as it started out as part of conversations also with Emily Linneman, the former director of UACES, about the kind of things that we wanted to do as an association to really push forward the agenda. So what we're trying to do with this report is to focus on those areas of our discipline that we can really kind of think about as constituting the future of EU studies, and also the way that we understand the subject of European studies more broadly. Hence why we started focusing on the canon itself and textbooks as a starting point of analysis. Before I move on to discuss the actual finding of our report, the theoretical framework that emerged from it, and the toolkit that we put together with a range of sensitizing questions for anyone who really wants to take on board some of the findings and some of the kind of work that we have done. What I'd really like to say is that I'm fully aware that there is a much broader, both of us are aware that there is a much broader area of work that can and will need to be done at some point. And there are also limitations embedded within our approach for this report itself. So with that in mind, we really want to see this as a starting point rather than the final product. The starting point for a conversation about where we want to see our discipline go. And I guess here, speaking also as a co-editor of JCMS, you will note, or one of the questions that might come up is why not journals as a starting point, as opposed to textbooks? Part of the reason for that is because as authors and editors of textbooks, we make choices, we make very active choices in conjunctions with publishers. Therefore, we can really start to shape what we see as the subject of our study. Whereas with journals, yes, editors have a lot of discretion, have a lot of vision that comes to the development of a strategic opportunities for, or strategic vision for the journal itself. But that also relies on authors seeing your journal as a place where they want to publish. And here, really, I think JCMS has done a huge amount of work in, for instance, in that regard, and linked up to UACES as well, starting with the work of Tony Hastrup as well as Richard Whitman, to try and broaden the way that we think about EU studies and the common market as a way in taking it forward, taking it into the 21st century, really looking at the future of EU studies. So what we wanted to do in terms of the report itself is to understand the salience of equality plus themes. And you will notice in the report, we move from talking about EDI to equalities plus. And I think that is not just a discursive pivot, but it is also a political pivot, insofar as EDIs are all too often now seen as embedded within a neoliberal agenda and is being co-opted by a number of economic and political actors. And we really want to move beyond that, to look at the kind of structures that prevent a more inclusive, and I think we both would argue, a better understanding of European studies. Why the canon, as I mentioned before, is because it's co-constitutive of the subject of our studies. We use the canon to train and to teach the next generation of EU studies scholars, but also the next generation of practitioners that will help to shape the way they understand the EU, the relationship between the EU and its member states, but more broadly, it helps to understand how we position this organization. So really, we want to think about the next generation EU studies. And in terms of constructing the canon, we went back to some of the key, I guess, actors or programs that are pillars of this construction. So we started looking at Jean Monnet Centers of Excellence as an institutional affiliation that helps us to understand and to define how the canon is understood. And within this context, we therefore then looked at their reading lists. So what are the books that we put forward to our students, that we use to socialize our students into our discipline or field, as you prefer, as we might want to come to define it. And then from that, we took out some of the most salient or most frequently used textbooks across different localities. And in terms of the actual disciplines that we have looked at, we examined politics, law, economics, international relations, and security. And what you see here is some of the gender breakdown of the authorship of the books. And what we're seeing is that women are still largely underrepresented as authors of textbooks. There are limitations in the way that we assign gender, which I think is important to note. But this, as I said earlier, this is an entry point to a broader discussion, to really understand the limitations of the story about the EU, its origin, its politics, and so on, as we currently understand it. So that led us to a theoretical framework for understanding the inclusion of equalities plus thematics within the canon. And we came up with, I guess it's a taxonomy or of different types of inclusions. And that go from visibility and belonging through to possibility to existence. And I guess possibilities to existence is the entry point for any kind of consideration. It occurs where there is lack of recognition of a particular research agenda and how that contributes to the field. Once we actually recognize a particular research agenda as being part of a field, and I would argue that in this context, gender and issues around gender, specifically the inclusion of women into the discipline, is starting to have some degree of possibility to existence. We're seeing more textbooks, including gender chapters. But what is still missing by and large is a shift to knowledgeability and belonging. So moving beyond tokenistic and superficial understanding of a research agenda to a much more inclusive and acknowledged history of that specific research agenda. So what we're looking at is moving from just identifying silences and omissions to understanding citation practices, debates, who is cited, who is engaged with, and why is it that sometimes some of the scholars that have opened up a discipline or a field are not cited when this field becomes mainstream. So what does that tell us about the canon and the politics of inclusion within the canon more broadly? Over to you.
And so what we're trying to discuss in this report is a way in which, let me try and find a better, less sound brazen background. I think we're trying to really encapture the different ways and different degrees to some extent, although I'm a bit stuck with the word degrees, but of what is the way in which different themes are included? Are they even imagined to be part of the canon, or they're not even there yet? And then once they are imagined to be part of the canon, how is it so? And so when we just look at an overarching, so we quoted all the textbooks in different ways in which equality themes would come about. So here on this graph, you see blue is for when there is a full chapter dedicated to a particular theme. Orange is when there's a subsection dedicated to a particular theme, so like a 2.1 or like a good chunk of text. And then in gray and in yellow, you see a brief discussion or just a single sentence reference, and then finally not included. And as we look at the different themes across all the disciplines, I think a real pattern emerges is that the majority of textbooks don't actually deal with equality plus themes to any degree of substance. Most textbooks would have brief discussion, single point reference, or no inclusion whatsoever. And I think, especially when it comes to other issues apart from gender and race, the absence, I think, speaks quite volumes across the different disciplines, particularly given the fact that the EU itself pretends to be, especially in the latest commission, to be a union of equality. And so the political discourse around the EU is much more about these equality plus themes, yet the textbooks have not necessarily caught on. And I think here we need to also make a caveat, which we do talk about in the report, about the time lag of academic publishing. And so these kind of later developments within reality takes a while to be featuring into textbooks. And that's, I think, particularly also why we see it as a starting point of discussion. I'm quite glad I saw some editors of publishers in the audience, that you're here to have this discussion, to think about who is invited to make textbooks. And I think the gender imbalance Roberta pointed to earlier matters, because we know different people write different knowledge, produce knowledge differently, open spaces for different sets of knowledges that otherwise wouldn't have done. So diversity, I think, is really key. But so what we see in this picture is, I would call a gross, well, not a gross, but like a large absence of absence that speaks volumes in a particular way. And that we do see gender as the kind of most visible equality plus themes across the disciplines. Now, when we are digging a bit deeper in each of the three disciplines, so we dig deeper in law, politics, and IR, the security studies we have folded into IR because there were just not enough submissions. And we also wanted to ensure that we didn't speak about individual textbooks, because we don't believe in singling out a particular textbook, because we are well aware that textbooks are a commercial endeavor, and therefore there were multiple pressures and multiple choices that are being made, and that we didn't see the point of emphasizing individual textbooks, but rather looking at the overarching theme. And to me, when I compare the three disciplines, is you see a quite significant difference in how the disciplines engage with equality plus themes, which also says a lot about the nature of the disciplines, I think. So in law, you see that actually most of the equality plus themes will have some, in some textbooks, a dedicated chapter, even though it's not in that many, but you see more inclusion across all the themes, which it shouldn't surprise us, given that the EU has quite a bit of primary and secondary law on anti-discrimination on particular fields in different ways. So to us, it wasn't so surprising to see that law is probably one of the disciplines that spends more attention to it, but we also think it's particularly because of its nature. But still, I think when we look at race and ethnicity, or what we also call gender plus and race plus questions, which are digging beyond the surface of particular representation, but also looking at the more power structures that are embedded within gender and race as a structure, we see that those remain largely absent across the textbooks. While for politics, we see a slightly different picture in the sense that it becomes much clearer which kind of equality fields are imagined to be part of the discipline. And I think gender, once again, is very present, with about 20% of the textbooks have a chapter or at least a significant subsection, or if nothing, a brief discussion. And so it's nearly 60% have gender discussed in some particular way. And then we see it kind of shrinking when we go to the more kind of niche fields. And I think even me having to say niche fields already says a lot about how the discourse or how the canon is constructed. And then in IR, we see that where politics is at least paying some attention to it across most of the fields, at least in a single reference, in IR, we see an absolute, quite surprisingly, absence of most of these fields, which says a lot about the state of IR, and perhaps also the IR in relation to European studies, which we might want to kind of think about what does that kind of, and I think this kind of report asks a lot more questions, not just about equality plus, but also about the disciplinary nature of our disciplines and how European studies is imagined across the kind of sub-disciplines that we are embedded. But I think looking at all of these pictures, and we've analyzed them in a bit more detail in the report, obviously, I think there's a clear kind of showcase of the silences that we see, and that to us, they speak quite loudly, hence also the title, The Sound of Silence. It's quite ear-deafening in a particular way. And so if we then kind of try and bring this together with our analytical framework and the different equality plus themes, is we see the different kind of, as Roberta kind of hinted to already, different stages or different ways in which our themes are included. Feminist critiques of gender hierarchies are still actually kind of missing of discussion, but there is an engagement with gender studies in such a particular way, although it's often still gender equals women kind of discourses, and we see, so it's the gender dimension can exist, so there's a possibility to exist, but only in a particular form and only in a particular way in which knowledge can be harnessed or gathered, often quite representational work, and it doesn't necessarily challenges the kind of gender binary that's embedded within the structures. So gender equality, I think, in European studies is a core thematic, but in how it's been discussed is quite limited. And actually, when we looked at the kind of citational practices, we also found that who gets to speak is quite interesting. When gender scholars or gender work is being discussed in a chapter, in a subsection, or in whatever length of discussion, we found a rather absence of the rich feminist literature on European studies. We found that actually often males, I was going to say mainstream, as David Dury-Smith writes about that, they are often referred to as colleagues who would have written it about once, but not necessarily the actual, as Roberta said, the people who opened up the space are often not really taken into account when we talk about the canon, which again erases a particular kind of work of body, and the knowledge is produced the work that needs to be done to gain access to a discipline doesn't get recognized by the canon, and other people who are already in more privileged positions within the canon often get the benefits from their work on it, whilst other people don't. So which is also quite interesting. Once this kind of visibility exists, is the conditions, and we've talked a lot about, I think, this report about the conditions of inclusion. What are the conditions? And I guess that's the framework in many ways seeks to get to. What are the conditions to be able to exist in the canon? And that's what we're trying to unravel and unpack and question and start a conversation about of how this is working. And it's about who gets to speak and when and how and about what. We see in race, maybe I'm not going to go through all these types of inclusion because that might become quite boring, and maybe you've read it already. But we see again, there is a recognition that race is quite important, especially after the Black Lives Matter movements. We see that within current publishing, current kind of new emerging scholarship, there's definitely much more attention to the decolonial, post-colonial approach to the EU. UACES network Euroglot is definitely an example of this. The DIMES project UACES has done is also showing that there is much more attention to decolonialize European studies. But obviously, this has not yet moved into the textbooks, and it would be quite interesting to consider how this has been done, who gets to speak, as we mentioned before, and trying to remove as many conditions on this type of knowledge within the canon. For LGBTQ plus issues, which I can talk about for hours, but I'll try not to. It's very marginal still within the European studies. It's a sexy kind of topic that gets kind of mentioned occasionally, but it never really been seen as part of the discipline. It's still, in my opinion, fighting its possibility to exist. It's getting there. But that's really still the contested nature of the scholarship, trying to break through the kind of margins to try and become more visible and try and become recognized as part of the canon. And then disability issues are remarkably absent. There is almost, it's not even imagined to be part of our scholarship. I mean, there is no, even in the imagination, there is no space for it yet. So it's so hidden within European studies that there is a question to be asked about the nature of academia in itself, the kind of able-bodied requirements to actually perform academia, I think, are questions that the absence of disability within the canon kind of raises. And to me, when I look at these reports, I mean, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of descriptive representation, as in it doesn't solve anything, but it does matter. And I think it's really clear here is who is not present on conferences, who is not present in particular spaces will also shape what knowledge can be imagined. So as a kind of key findings, I mean, I think most of it we kind of touched upon already, but we see actually quite a bit of silences and silos and kind of conditioning on equality plus themes, which in general remain underrepresented. They are still marginalized, they're still quite niche, and I think a lot of scholars working in these fields have a kind of sense of precariousness around their work within the field because it's a constant kind of argument of why it matters. And I think when we are in a position of power to construct a canon, to write a textbook, is worth to kind of remember and kind of reshift those kind of boundaries and power structures. But within that, we see that gender is the most visible equalities theme, which shouldn't surprise us given that gender is one of the only characteristics actually written into the Statute of Rome or the Rome Treaty. So it's the one that's been around from the beginning. But even that, despite the institutional setup, it's still quite a long way of being actually considered to be part of the canon. Because quite often or not, gender is equal with women's rights, which then erases a lot of feminist work and critique on the gender binary, as well as the kind of patriarchal structures of society, the European and the European Union, so forth. The same we could say about race and ethnicity. Often it's subsumed under themes of migration, which means we don't actually tend to talk about race as a power structure, race as a tool of analysis in of itself, but it's only an entry point to talk about migration, which again, I think says a lot about how we imagine the European Union as many have said, Fortress Europe, which is in that kind of embeddedness. We see, again, the kind of structures and conditions of which we can talk about certain of these topics. And then I think the final point is that intersectionalities, I think it's become a very dominant space within political discourse, within activism, yet somehow it has not yet made its link into our analysis, or at least not into the canon, which I really think if we want to really address all the questions we're trying to raise in this report, we must have a affinity with intersectionality and intersectional political approaches, but also we must think about what does that mean. And I think that here's where I'm looking at the editors of publishers. What does it mean to do an intersectional publishing kind of process, I guess. And I think that leads us to the toolkit for inclusion. Roberta, you want to take it?
So the idea of the toolkit for inclusion is to provide editors, authors, but also module or unit leaders and conveners with a set of sensitizing questions about how to construct a reading list, how to construct the kind of outline of a book or any kind of book. So, and here we really focus on becoming more aware of omissions and biases. So for instance, starting with that is really kind of starting to understand what we need to know in order to understand the EU. And when we ask ourselves that question, we then can start to delve into like, why do we need to know those topics? Why are the certain topics deemed to be most salient over others? And what are the kind of mythologies that we embed within the canon and the way that we teach the canon? And who's excluded, whose stories are not being told? Consider citation practice. I still think it's peculiar. And actually, can we stop share for a second?
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the audience. And I'd like to see a show of hands here for everyone who's read Catherine Hoskin's piece, Integrating Gender. How many people have read Cynthia Enlow's book, Banana Beaches and Bases, or any books by Cynthia Enlow? Okay, we've got 2. I don't think we had a single one. Okay, 3, 4. Amazing. And we're all Europeanists, right? Can I ask, isn't it interesting that we're not familiar with the work of Catherine Hoskins? She published her book in 1996, really opened the space for gender in the context of EU studies, and we're not familiar with her work at all. So I think it's really interesting that we stop and reflect on that as in terms of our own practice, whose story has been allowed to shape the canon, and what is the difference between those two, these two authors. And if you haven't read Integrating Gender, I still think it's a really useful book to go back and have a look. So we then also talk about including and engaging with interdisciplinary approaches and embedding methodological pluralism, which I think is absolutely key in order to recognize the difference within our own discipline. And actually, methodological approaches, I think we've had lots of conversations about this. We both feel is a tool for inclusion because it allows us to ask very complex questions about data collection, data analysis, how we define categories, right? And we started out by saying the way that we've gone about this is inevitably limited. We made a number of assumptions, about the gender of the author. So we assume gender, which is problematic. And I think we both recognize that is problematic. But we wanted this to be the starting point of the conversation. Therefore, acknowledging those kind of limitations are absolutely key. I think that's it. Yeah. So I think I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, it's over to you.
I think I want to just
Yeah.
say
Oh, sorry.
No, I'll say one more point, because the methodological differences, I think one of the things we're also very aware of is we're not intending to kind of prioritize one set of knowledges over another. It's actually opening up the space of kind of creating an equal footing. And one of the things I always think about is how people who are in the equalities plus sphere has to defend that their work is scholarship, it's scholarly. I always think everybody should reflect on the political nature of their work as well as the scholarly nature of their work. And it's actually opening up a kind of a conversation to level the playing field, as it were, although I don't like that expression. So that's where it kind of, for me, comes up. But yeah, thanks everyone for being here and listening to us.